Hey y'all, welcome to our first lecture covering health behaviors. Buckle up, this is a beast of a lecture because we're covering two big ones, exercise and sleep. So we'll start off with exercise and then of course make our way to sleep. Again, there is an optional sleep diary posted on As You Learn. If you're interested, I would suggest filling it out at least 2 or 3 nights to give yourself some data because we will be working with that. And it can be interesting to just kind of see what your own data looks like as you're learning more about sleep and sleep interventions. But first, let's talk about exercise. So let's introduce the kind of basics in terms of exercise and physical activity terms and things of that nature to be familiar with. So physical activity is movement, any type of movement, including exercise, including leisure time, like bustling around the house, chores, things like that, walking your dog. It can include transportation, like walking or biking to work, and it can also include any movement at work, like walking around an office, or if a person's engaged in a more physically demanding job, like construction or something like that. So physical activity is a pretty broad term that basically just encompasses movement. Physical exercise is planned, purposeful, repetitive physical activity. In general, there are two different types of physical exercise. We've got aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic is light to moderate intensity in nature, and it's exercise that a person engages in for an extended period of time. And because of this, it becomes really important how efficiently oxygen is being utilized in the body. So things like running, swimming, biking are things that people engage in for longer amounts of time. It becomes important how well a person's cardiorespiratory system is functioning because a person has to effectively utilize oxygen in order to sustain exercise for that long period of time. And that's actually where the name aerobic comes from, is the term aerobic comes from oxygen and oxygen usage. Anaerobic, or lack of oxygen, doesn't necessarily mean that a person engages in this exercise while holding their breath, but because this exercise is higher intensity, it isn't engaged in for as long. Typically, anaerobic exercise lasts less than 2 minutes, and so it doesn't require the body to adapt the way in which oxygen is being used in order to sustain that activity. Examples include things like sprinting or weightlifting. A person's basal or resting metabolic rate is the amount of energy that a person's body uses at baseline or during rest. A very basic way to calculate this is to multiply a person's weight by 13. Those of you who are coming to this class from more kind of health types of backgrounds like exercise science or nursing know that this is a gross oversimplification of this calculation, but it's a good basic one and it's as detailed as we're going to get in this particular class. Physical activity and exercise require additional energy. And so the amount of energy a person needs to take in every day is going to increase with any added physical activity or exercise. And so the two complement one another. And what is consumed to provide that energy, both baseline and added energy in the form of energy needed to fuel activity and exercise? Calories. Calories are what we consume to provide that energy. 1 calorie equals the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And technically speaking, the calories that you see on nutrition labels are actually kilocalories, but one of the reasons that we refer to them as calories versus kilocalories is to make the numbers seem more manageable for consumers. These are some examples of calorie equivalents just to kind of show how physical exercise compares to physical activity. So we've got examples on here ranging from anaerobic to aerobic exercises, weightlifting, stretching, running, swimming, more game-like things like playing soccer, but then also activities like shoveling snow, heavy cleaning, or playing around with kids, just to kind of show how these activities compare to one another. Physical fitness is an umbrella term used to refer to different characteristics that a person may pursue through physical activity and physical exercise. Cardiorespiratory endurance, which is measured by a person's VO2 max, or the maximum amount of oxygen that they're able to use while exercising, is a good way to measure the body's ability to supply working muscles with oxygen. And so, of course, aerobic exercise is going to be a good way to work on one's cardiorespiratory endurance. Muscular strength and muscular endurance may seem like the same thing, but they're different. Muscular strength is the amount of force muscle can exert in a single maximal effort. So a person's 1 rep max. And weightlifting or anaerobic exercise, unsurprisingly, are good ways to pursue muscular strength. Muscular endurance is the ability of a muscle to remain active for a long period of time, so doing a larger number of reps or holding a position for a long period of time. And so weightlifting and more kind of stretching types of exercises like yoga can be really good for this. Flexibility is the ability of a muscle to lengthen. So yoga, again, can be good for this. And then body composition is a person's ratio of fat to lean mass, which would include both muscle and bone. And a combination of anaerobic and aerobic exercise can be good for body comp. So again, these are characteristics that a person may pursue through physical exercise. Exercise or being active can be broken down by the reason, meaning that we can give patients different recommendations or prescriptions based on the reason that they're trying to exercise or get fit. And so we're going to break this down according to whether or not a person has a chronic illness or they're trying to prevent chronic illness, whether they're trying to exercise for longer life, or whether they may be exercising for mental health reasons such as depression, anxiety, or stress resilience. So up first, physical exercise for chronic illnesses. Um, the recommendation that we typically end up kind of falling back on if we're trying to promote cardiovascular health and prevent the more common chronic illnesses is going to be the American Heart Association recommendations for physical activity. These are probably the recommendations that you guys are most familiar with, and in a nutshell, it breaks down to aerobic and anaerobic recommendations. So aerobically, a person either needs to engage in at least 30 minutes, 5 days a week of moderate intensity exercise for a total of 150 minutes each week, or 25 minutes of vigorous aerobic activity 3 days a week for a total of 75 minutes. And at least 2 days of moderate to high intensity muscle strengthening activity, which would include anaerobic weightlifting types of things. So this is the AHA recommendation, and it's been associated with overall physical fitness as well as weight control, in that by following these recommendations, a person is expending more energy, but also that exercise is having a chemical impact on the body, which is going to decrease hunger and promote fullness. Specifically, ghrelin is the hunger hormone, and both aerobic and anaerobic exercise have been shown to decrease ghrelin. And PPY is one of our body's full hormones, which aerobic exercise has been shown to increase. In addition, these recommendations may protect against osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, colorectal, breast, prostate, and lung cancers, diabetes, and something called metabolic syndrome. Metabolic syndrome, or METS for short, is basically when a person has disrupted their metabolism relatively permanently in some situations, to the extent that they're increasing their risk for heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. In order to diagnose metabolic syndrome, a person must have 3 of the 5 symptoms depicted in the graphic on the right side of the screen. This includes excess abdominal weight, or an apple shape, insulin resistance, high blood pressure, high triglyceride levels, or low HDL cholesterol. And we'll talk more about what the different types of cholesterol are in our next chapter, so don't worry too much about that just yet. METS is diagnosed most commonly among African American women. And at this point, I would suggest pausing to watch REI Presents The Myrnovator. She is a wonderful woman. I really love her. She is someone who clearly has metabolic syndrome, and she is a distance runner. So she is a nice example of how healthy behaviors don't always match up with body shape and weight. So she is someone who has done some damage to her metabolism. So she is still overweight, despite the fact that she covers extremely long distances on a regular basis. So again, an excellent example of how health doesn't always match up with body weight or shape in the way that many people think that it does. As far as those AHA guidelines go, I do want to point out that new guidelines are published about every 10 years, and the most recent guidelines came out in 2018. If you'd like to read news coverage of those guidelines, there are 2 links for you here if you'd like to learn more. But in a nutshell, I've kind of posted a summary of those guidelines, or I guess the big takeaways, on the upper right-hand side of the screen. Namely, the new guidelines state that Americans seeking to stay healthy can get their exercise in small increments of just a few minutes at a time, and that these recommendations do away with the official government position that physical activity should occur in sessions of at least 10 minutes. So basically what this means is that any movement counts. So a person can start tracking their steps using a pedometer and can total up, the 5 minutes it takes to walk from the parking lot into their office building as physical activity and exercise. So before, you had to be moving for at least 10 minutes to count that towards your total of 150 or 75 minutes. But again, now any movement counts. And this research is really in line with Blue Zone research, which is the research that Dan Buettner's How to Live to Be 100 focuses on. I always get a lot of questions about Blue Zone. Where does blue come from? Doesn't really mean anything. It was the color that he used on his map to identify these various zones. Basically, what Buettner did was he studied these communities around the world that had a larger percentage than normal of people who were living to be 100 or greater. And he kind of took note of what people were doing in those communities. And what he determined through his research was that lifestyle seemed to be more important than genes in promoting longevity, and that in general, humans seem to be programmed to hit the point of procreative success, meaning the point at which a person has procreated or had children and has lived long enough to see their children have children. At that point, our bodies really seem to drop off in terms of health pretty dramatically. Ending more or less in the established maximum human lifespan of about 120. And in terms of predicting longevity, again, he asserts that lifestyle is more important than genes, and that's kind of what his research has backed up. You'll see a lot of keys identified in that article I asked you to read, but in a nutshell, some of the main takeaways in terms of the lifestyle factors that promote longevity are physical exercise as being more important than, or physical activity, excuse me, being more important than physical exercise. In fact, some of these communities don't engage in physical exercise at all. Many of these communities are more rural, kind of farming types of communities where people aren't CrossFitting, 5, 6 days a week, but they're farming. And so they're covering huge distances. They're very, very active, although they aren't really exercising. There's also a lot of downshift time where a person doesn't really have a stress response. So this could include observing a day of rest each week or something of that nature. So there's not like the go, go, go grind that we're very accustomed to in the United States. There's also a lifelong sense of purpose. So there's not really a retirement where a person just kind of stops. People just kind of work. And even if they're kind of slowing down, they're focused on being grandparents, and there's always kind of this sense of purpose, or they're focused on their hobbies. Another key is the plant-based diet. So it doesn't mean vegan or vegetarian, that means plant-based, so primarily plants versus meat products. In addition, there isn't really a lot of overeating, and this can be done in a couple of different ways. Some of these communities, like the Seventh-day Adventist community in Loma Linda, California, fasts, and the community in Okinawa, Japan abides by I forget if it's the 70 or the 80% rule, but basically they eat until they're 70 to 80% full versus eating to complete fullness every time. And there's even some alcohol consumption in some of these communities as well. There's also social connection, which is important, but in particular, there's social connection with like-minded folks. So other people who also value physical activity, downshift time, lifelong sense of purpose, plant-based diets. Um, it's important to have social connection with people who have good health behaviors and who value health, because that can help keep you personally more accountable as well. If a person is hoping to exercise for longevity, and at this point we know that, I mean, if you're really wanting to achieve longevity, physical exercise or physical activity may be more key than physical exercise. But if a patient is really kind of asking you as a professional, like, how much do I need to be running, or how much do I want to be doing, if I want to add years to my life, at the end of the day, we can use math to provide them with an answer. So, research pretty consistently suggests that people who engage in regular physical exercise may extend their lives by only about 2 years. So, it's not a huge addition of time. And again, the data on the last slide suggests that physical activity can do a good bit of that as well. And so if we know that we're going to get an end gain of about 2 years, we can use math to kind of work backwards and see what we're going to be gaining from different amounts of exercise as input. So if a person begins jogging, let's say 30 minutes a day, most days of the year. So for easy math, let's just use the number 360 versus 365. This person would be jogging for a total of 180 hours each and every year. Over 40 years, so assuming they start this habit when they're 25 and they continue until they're 65, this is 7,200 hours over that period of time, which totals 450 waking days. So waking days, 16 hours, assuming that you're asleep the other 8 hours. So this means that this person has been jogging for 1.25 waking years over a 40-year period of time. So if they spend 1.25 years running and they gain 2 years, their net gain is about 9 months. So they've added 9 months to their life that they can use to do whatever it is that they want. If we apply that same formula to a 60-minute-a-day jogging routine, this ends up totaling in 2.5 waking years, which means that there's actually a net loss of time in terms of, yes, that person's added time to their life, but all of that time was spent running. So at the end of the day, if I have someone who's asking me about exercise and longevity, I say that if you're really focused on longevity and that's the only reason you want to run, that you hate running otherwise, that aim for about 30 minutes a day. Anything more than that isn't significantly adding to longevity, and all of that added time is basically spent doing that activity. And so if you hate it, it's kind of a moot point. So only spend more than 30 minutes a day on exercise if you really love the activity. Depression is another reason that people may be looking to exercise more. And this is one of the areas that we saw covered a little bit in that article I had you guys read earlier about transformative and therapeutic lifestyle changes. So we haven't really talked about how to diagnose depression in this class, and that's a little bit beyond the scope of this class. In a nutshell, I will tell you some common depressive symptoms are things like low mood, poor motivation for enjoyable activities, difficulty concentrating, low self-esteem, and sleep and appetite changes. Ultimately, exercise works for depression because it addresses a wide range of depressive symptoms, including the fact that it improves self-esteem, it increases our body's levels of endorphins, dopamine, and serotonin, which promote well-being, improved mood, improved motivation, better attention, better impulse control, and improved self-esteem. And ultimately, it also counteracts the effects of cortisol, which is our body's stress hormone, to decrease stress at the end of the day. And these are many of the same chemical changes that we see as a consequence of antidepressants as well. As a general recommendation for depression, I like to recommend that patients exercise for about 30 minutes 3 times a week at 70 to 85% of their max heart rate. This is helpful for patients with major depressive disorder, and an expected outcome outcome is that if a patient abides by this prescription, they will have decreased odds of continuing to meet criteria for depression as time passes. A really interesting point about this series of research that was done by Blumenthal and Babiak, late 90s and early 2000s, is that they compared exercise with Zoloft with a combination group that used both of those treatments. And at the end of their initial trial period, they saw pretty comparable improvements across all three groups. But what's really interesting is that at several months follow-up, the exercise group was outperforming the Zoloft group and the combination group. They had lower remission rates than either of those other two groups, suggesting that exercise may take longer to work, but in the long run, exercise may be better for depression than medication. This is for more mild to moderate depression, so I will say that severe to chronic depression is a little bit different. For those more intense types of depression, a formula that I like to use is to multiply body weight by 8 and assign that to a patient as their weekly calorie burn. This has been associated with a decrease in depressive symptoms of about 50%. And again, this can be a helpful prescription for more chronic or severe depression. Again, kind of like with depression, clinical trials show that exercise is as effective as certain medications for treating anxiety. Exercise works for anxiety because it teaches that the stress response isn't scary. One of the things that can impair people so intensely about anxiety is that their heart rates go up, they start sweating, they start freaking out, and they really react very strongly to these physical symptoms that are the same physical symptoms a person experiences when they work out. You know, they get sweaty, they have a tough time breathing, but they're not scared because they understand the circumstance. And so by talking about exercise in that way, we can help teach people that in the same way they don't worry about how their body responds to exercise, they don't need to worry about how their body responds to anxiety. As I mentioned before, exercise also increases some chemicals that can be really helpful for self-esteem and mood. Another chemical that is secreted that I didn't talk about earlier is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. In layman's terms, this is kind of like a memory juice that helps your brain really cement and retain new information. And so this is great because it's kind of like a double whammy. We're teaching patients this new lesson about anxiety, and then we're also flooding their brain with this chemical that's going to help them retain that lesson. Exercise also helps to reduce muscle tension, and so in that way, it's a symptom reducer, and it also mobilizes you, which is the opposite of anxiety and depression. A good prescription for anxiety is 20 minutes of low intensity aerobic exercise 3 times a week. This is really helpful for clients who have very high anxiety sensitivity, meaning clients that are really prone to feeling anxiety and feeling those physical symptoms in their body. At the end of the day, these folks can expect to have improvements with respect to their interpretation of anxiety symptoms, meaning a decreased misinterpretation of those symptoms. And if we increase the intensity rate to more high intensity, we can see faster results and an even more dramatic decrease in terms of fear of those anxiety symptoms. And finally, if we are hoping to impact stress resilience, meaning how well a person handles stress, you know, we've talked about earlier in this class how moderate, controllable stress can actually make a person more able to handle stress in the future. So now we're really going to talk about like what that prescription is. Um, it is basically physical exercise once a week. This can be really helpful for folks who are more prone to the negative emotional consequences of stress and can really foster emotional resilience in the long run. And again, this is because the more moderate controllable stress our bodies experience, the better capable, the better we are to handle stress in the future, the more capable we feel, greater sense of mastery, self-confidence, all of those good things. Some additional things to consider are that it's never too late to exercise. So research suggests that nursing home residents may double their strength with just a 10-week muscle strengthening and resistance training program. 50 to 70-year-old sedentary women may reduce bone loss and increase muscle mass and strength with exercise. And many of the cases reviewed in Buettner's article that I had you guys read exemplified how exercise and activity in old age can be really beneficial. Ed and Marge are two examples. Other things to consider are that people don't exercise for a variety of reasons. We reviewed some of the more general health behavior reasons in chapter 6, but some more specific things are not enough resources. So this is a really common problem for folks of low income and education across the board. It's harder for these folks to make dietary changes, sleep changes, because they really just don't have the luxury of resources to make these changes easier. Um, some people may have fearful myths surrounding exercise. So, older folks, for instance, might believe that exercising is dangerous or that they're going to hurt themselves when this simply isn't the case, particularly when that exercise is being supervised. People might believe that they can't really do it. That's what self-efficacy means, is a person's belief that they can do something. And so, poor self-efficacy may be at play, a lack of motivation. Additionally, some people may experience something called forecasting myopia, which is a really fancy way of saying that they don't think exercise is going to be enjoyable. So they're kind of engaging in a future telling type of phenomenon where they just don't think it's going to be fun. And so they're not going to do it. It can be really helpful to integrate recommendations with respect to the stage of change a person is at. So, for instance, if a person is experiencing forecasting myopia as a part of their contemplation stage, we could address that as a way to maybe move them forward to the preparation stage. Okay, I'm gonna hop out of these slides real quick because I got an alert that my battery is low. And so I want to make sure that I don't lose my computer in the middle of this, and I'm just gonna risk it. All right, so shifting gears to sleep. Okay, so sleep is really critical for our health. In general, poor sleep is associated with more stress, overeating, excess weight gain, and more pain, interestingly enough. About 20% of adults are sleep deprived. This includes 70 million Americans whose sleep deprivation may be caused by sleep disorder, including insomnia, narcolepsy, sleepwalking, and sleep apnea. These are not the only sleep disorders, but these are the ones that we'll talk about today. Other people may experience sleep deprivation or impairment as a consequence of stress or demanding work and school schedules. Sleep may be a particular problem for teenagers who need about 8.5 to 9.5 hours per night, but unfortunately average less than 7. This is 2 hours less than older generations got as teenagers, which is something that we call social jet lag. Basically means that socially, as far as sleep goes, we are behind compared with earlier generations. Nearly 1/3 of high school students report they routinely fall asleep in class. To better understand sleep, we are first going to examine the circadian rhythm, sleep stages, and sleep patterns. Then we'll move on to sleep diagnoses and finally sleep treatments. So, the circadian rhythm is our body's 24-hour cycle of night and day, where we are awake and alert for part of the day when the sun is up, and we are dormant when the sun is down, when it's dark. This rhythm is obviously linked to sun exposure. So, sun exposure and light is what helps us keep straight day versus night. And research has shown that animals in total darkness eventually develop a free running rhythm that is independent of what the sun is doing. So, the sun is critical to us doing the same things at the same times of the day. So, being alert at the same times, being asleep and dormant at the same times. A Zeitgeber is a German word for timekeeper. It basically means the things in our life that help us maintain rhythm. So sun and light is the main Zeitgeber. But other things include things like getting up at the same time each day, consuming meals at the same time each day, exercising at the same time each day. If a person is trying to reset their rhythm, I recommend doing these things at the same time, plus or minus 30 minutes each day if we're trying to kind of reset rhythm. This can be particularly important if a person is transitioning between time zones or if they find that their mood is really erratic. That can be a cue that it's particularly important to maintain a consistent circadian rhythm versus doing things at random times on different days. So there are several different stages of sleep. So that dormant stage that we enter into ideally at night, most of us at night. In general, there are two broad types of sleep. We have non-rapid eye movement sleep, or NREM state, or NREM sleep, that occurs across three different stages, and we have rapid eye movement sleep, or REM sleep, which is and each of these stages is distinguished by different brain waves, changes in breathing and muscle tension, and other bodily changes. In general, we cycle through each of these four stages once every 90 minutes, but that's a little bit of an oversimplification, and I'll show you a graph on the next slide that really kind of highlights what those sleep cycles kind of look like over the course of the night. So the first stage is the N1 stage. This is the briefest and lightest stage of sleep. This is when a person might even still be loosely aware of the fact that they're awake and falling asleep. The N2 stage is kind of a light sleep stage. This is where respiration rate and heart rate even out and a person's body temperature drops. It's important that these things drop a little bit at night because while some of our organ systems can get breaks, like our digestive system, for instance, gets a break when there's no food in there, but we can't ever stop breathing, or our heart can't stop beating, or we can't just stop regulating our body temperature, but we can take a relative break by letting these things drop a little bit at night. And about half of all sleep for adults is spent in this N2 stage. N3 is our deep sleep, and this is when our immune system is really active, fighting off any invaders, and when our body releases human growth hormone to facilitate any muscle repair or damage repair. This is actually one of the reasons why you might work out really hard and go to sleep and not really feel sore until the next morning. It's because that HGH was really active during your deep sleep, repairing all that muscle damage, and so now you feel sore the next morning. This is also one of the reasons why, if you are really stressed out and your sleep stages are getting wonky, that you are more prone to be sick, or kids may be prone to stress dwarfism, which I talked about earlier in the class, is because they're not getting to this deeper stage of sleep where we're seeing an immune boost and an HGH boost. During the final stage, which is REM, the eyes are really active, hence the name. This is also the stage where dreams are really common. This is where our body consolidates memories over the course of the previous day. The brainstem also, to a degree, blocks messages from the motor cortex, and so there is a degree of paralysis during this particular stage. You might even recall kind of waking from this stage and feeling kind of groggy, and like it kind of takes a minute to start moving again. So again, these are kind of the stages that a person cycles through about every 90 to 110, 120 minutes. But you can see that it's not as simple as stage 1, 2, 3 REM. The graphic on the right side of the screen shows that over the course of the night, the stages look different. So we spend less and less time in stage 1 as the night progresses. We also spend more time, relatively speaking, in stage 3, closer to the beginning of the night, and more time in REM sleep closer to the morning. So most of our dreaming is done closer to the time that we wake up. Sleep patterns in general do differ a little bit depending on how old we are. So even that graphic on the previous slide isn't true necessarily for everybody. Newborns obviously have a very different sleep cycle. They sleep 15 to 17 hours a day in 2 to 3 hour segments. This is because the brain is not yet mature, and so they need more sleep for their brains to continue to develop, and sleep ultimately decreases over time. About 50% of this early sleep is REM sleep, and that is again because that's the stage where we're seeing a lot of memory consolidation. And so newborns are really kind of retaining and working on remembering all of that new stuff that they're soaking up. Adults, at least in the United States, sleep on average 6.8 hours a day on weekdays and 7.4 hours a day on weekends. Ideally, we want people to be getting more in that 7 to 9 hour range. Sleep may be affected by genes, light, work schedules, and other diversions, such as whether or not a person is watching a lot of TV or on the internet or on a screen before going to sleep. As I mentioned before, social jet lag also plays a role, and we see the poorest sleep quality among minority groups and those with a lower income. In general, people also tend to shift from night owls who like to stay up late and get up late to early birds around the age of 20. This obviously doesn't happen for everybody. I know plenty of adults who are still night owls, but this is a general shift that is, you see kind of on average. Sleep disorders is where we're going to shift to next. So a few nights sleep can result in something called sleep debt, which is where you're kind of chronically behind in terms of the amount of sleep that you ought to be getting. A lot of people think they can just kind of crash and make this up, but that's not really the case. You can't really repay sleep debt with one night's oversleeping, and sleep debt can actually last for about 2 weeks. So you might find that you're still kind of groggy and out of it, even if it's been a while since you've been sleep deficient. It's because your body kind of carries this memory. Sleep disorders may be the cause of such debt. And again, they include insomnia, narcolepsy, sleepwalking, and sleep apnea. Insomnia is a dissatisfaction with sleep quality or quantity indicated by one or more of these symptoms, which include difficulty initiating sleep, difficulty maintaining sleep, and early morning awakenings with an inability to return to sleep. So waking up at like 3 or 4 in the morning and not being able to go back to sleep. This doesn't have to happen every night. That's a common misconception about insomnia. It just has to happen 3 nights a week for at least 3 months. The sleep difficulty has to persist despite adequate opportunity for sleep, meaning that you can't diagnose like a shift worker or even like a college student who has like a ton of work to do between school and work and only has like 6 hours a night for sleep. So if a person only has a 4, 5, 6 hour window each night for sleep and that's all they're sleeping, that's not insomnia. Insomnia is when there's adequate opportunity, but the brain is not producing sleep. About 10% of adults and 25% of older adults live with insomnia, and college students are among those who are most likely to be sleep deprived, although not necessarily all of those folks have insomnia, as I mentioned before. Substance use may seem like a quick fix, but it ultimately worsens the problem because substance use decreases sleep latency, means that it helps you fall asleep. It also increases total time asleep, but it decreases deep sleep and REM sleep. So you pass out basically and you sleep for a long period of time, but it's crap sleep. It's a lot of N1 and N2, but it's not a lot of N3 or REM, which, as you guys saw, are the most important stages. Narcolepsy is defined as periods, recurrent periods of an irrepressible need to sleep, lapsing into sleep, or napping occurring within the same day. And we're looking for this to happen at least 3 times a week over a 3-month period of time. It's most commonly associated with cataplexy, which is a brief bilateral loss of muscle tone while conscious. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes precipitated by laughter or joking, so the person gets excited, and this kind of leads to kind of like a collapse, kind of ragdoll type of scenario. It may be associated with either a hypocretin deficiency, which is a chemical that regulates arousal and wakefulness, so people may not have enough of that, and that can facilitate narcolepsy. Alternatively, sleep studies may yield that the person enters REM sleep within 15 minutes of falling asleep, which is very rare and unusual. And so there's kind of a propensity for REM sleep, which might explain why a person enters sleep from wakefulness immediately. There's no real clinical reason for me to share this video of Rusty. It's completely optional. It's just a really sweet video of a dachshund with narcolepsy, and it's one of my favorite videos and I like showing it. So enjoy. um, Next up, we have sleepwalking. This is a really long clinical term, but it's the term in the DSM, which is our Manual of Mental Health Disorders, which includes sleep disorders. Sleepwalking is a non-rapid eye movement sleep arousal disorder of the sleepwalking type. What this is it is recurrent episodes of incomplete awakening from sleep, specifically from NREM, and usually occurs during the first third of sleep. meaning like the first 2 to 3 hours a person's asleep. So there are multiple different types of NREM movement sleep arousal disorders. There's sleepwalking, there's also sleep terrors, sleep eating, sexsomnia or sleep sexual behaviors, and there's also sleepwalking. Sleepwalking is when a person tends to have a blank staring face, they're relatively unresponsive to others, and they may be fully awakened but with great difficulty. Because they're in an NREM stage and they're not dreaming, it's more likely that this is going to take the form of kind of like a zombie-like shuffle, versus if a person appears to be acting something out, it may be more likely that they're sleepwalking from a REM stage, which is a different diagnosis that is called a REM sleep behavior disorder. The person can't really recall any dreams, and has amnesia for episodes most of the time. And again, that's because they're in an NREM stage. So their mind's not really conjuring dreams and pictures in the same way they might be doing during a REM type of sleepwalking. Again, I have a delightful dog video for you. This little angel's name is Biscuit. He appears to be having more of a REM sleep behavior disorder, as it seems clear that he is acting something out. So again, completely optional, but if you'd like to pause and watch a cute little dog video, this is one of my favorites. And finally, we have obstructive sleep apnea. This is diagnosed when a person has 5 or more obstructive sleep apneas or hypopneas per hour of sleep. A sleep apnea is a complete breathing obstruction. A hypopnea is a partial breathing obstruction. So 5 or more per hour. So that means if we've got a person who's sleeping 8 hours a night, they're having 40 of these at least. So it's a huge number of times that a person cannot breathe while they are asleep. I emphasize that because that's just really intense when you really pause to wrap your mind around it. In addition, we have to see snoring, snorting, gasping, and breathing pauses during sleep, or fatigue and unrefreshing sleep during the day. Fatigue during the day, remarks of unrefreshing sleep. Chronic sleep debt increases body weight, body mass, and obesity. So these are some of the health complications we may see. Less sleep is cumulatively associated with a higher percentage of body fat. Some of the reasons for this is that poor sleep kind of does the opposite of what we talked about earlier with exercise. So it increases ghrelin, that hunger hormone, and it decreases leptin, which is another full hormone. Unsurprisingly, obstructive sleep apnea increases cardiometabolic risk due to regular triggering of the stress response. I mean, when you can't breathe during the night, even if you're unconscious for it, you're still activating your body's stress response. And so that is revving up blood pressure, and just contributing to all of that damage that we talked about in chapter 4. Sleep loss can also be linked with chronic inflammation and insulin resistance. Okay, so those are our disorders. So now we're going to talk about ways to identify and treat poor sleep. In general, I like to start off by screening for sleep quality generally, following that up with a sleep diary. And then moving forward with some type of treatment. And we're going to talk about 5 different approaches. And in general, these are organized in order of increasing intensity, meaning that we're going to start with the simplest interventions first and work up towards the more intense ones. I will also say that interventions 3 through 5 are aimed more so at insomnia and bipolar disorders. So for most everything, the first 2 are sufficient, but for insomnia, some of the bipolar disorders, 3, 4, and 5 are ones we may work towards. So in terms of screening for sleep, this is a really great sleep screener. Basically, you would ask a patient to answer true or false for these. And if a person responds true to 3 or more, that may indicate poor sleep. It's not diagnostic, but it's just an indicator that your sleep could be better. This is a sleep diary, and again, this is what I gave you guys access to on As You Learn. I always like to give people this if sleep is a concern. It basically entails each morning reflecting on the previous day in terms of naps, what you did to fall asleep, and your bedtime and morning routine. So I like people to take note of whether they napped, whether they took something to fall asleep, when they got into bed, when they turned off the lights and tried to fall asleep, how long it took them to fall asleep, how often they woke up, how long they were awake when they woke up, when they woke up in the morning, when they got out of bed, and whether that was earlier than they wanted to. And then I also like to ask about exercise as well. So did you engage in any type of exercise over the course of the day? And then finally asking people to rate the quality of their sleep as well. So this is helpful because it gives me kind of a pattern, like, did you have an off day, or are there any patterns over the course of the week? The importance too of being really nitpicky with like getting into bed versus turning off the lights versus actually falling asleep, and how long were you awake in the middle of the night? When did you wake up versus when did you get out of bed? That all becomes important later on if we are talking about bed restriction. So we'll circle back to some of this data later on. So up first, as far as interventions go, we've got sleep hygiene. This is one of our more basic recommendations. Basically, these are a series of recommendations aimed at improving your sleep hygiene, improving the health of your sleep. Recommendation number one has to do with classical conditioning. So we basically want to use our bedroom for sleep and sex only. The couch is for your computer, TV, etc., not sleep. And the basis of this is in stimulus control, meaning that if you are in the habit of working in your bed or just on your phone a lot in your bed, your brain can learn to associate work or like stressful social media time with your bed, and your brain can actually get more stressed out when you're in your bed versus relaxing. So we want to make sure that we're working and doing other stuff in a different environment. And similarly, we want to make sure that if we get up in the middle of the night to go to the couch, that we don't get in the habit of falling asleep on the couch, because again, you're just kind of conditioning your brain to be really awake in your bed and then to finally fall asleep on the couch, when we really want the opposite to be true. We want to make sure that we're getting up at a regular time every day, regardless of how much or little a person slept. This is really important for stabilizing circadian rhythm. It's important to do this 7 days a week. We want to make sure that we don't oversleep, because this prevents our circadian clock from setting itself correctly and can actually facilitate insomnia. So oversleeping can actually make it more likely to undersleep later. And if a person sleeps in, I recommend not deviating from the regular rise time by more than an hour or two. Meaning that if you get up at 7:30 for work, sleeping in should be till about 8:30 or 9:30 at the latest. Avoid naps. Naps suck because they disrupt a person's sleep drive, which increases the longer you're awake. So napping during the day and then being frustrated that you can't fall asleep is kind of the same as having a snack right before dinner and then being frustrated that you're not hungry for dinner. And believe it or not, if you're getting the right amount of sleep that you need at night, you actually will not need to nap during the day. Avoid caffeine after 2 p.m. Not everybody needs to do this, but if you're having a tough time sleeping, this is something to consider. Definitely wind down 30 minutes before bed. So definitely no screen time, preferably lower light and something else relaxing like stretching or progressive muscle relaxation, something like that. Only to go to bed when you're tired. Don't force it. So the rise time is really important. The bedtime, not so much. Ideally, a regular bedtime will emerge, but there might be nights where you're just not tired at the time you normally are. If you're not tired, don't force it. Do something relaxing until you're tired and then go to sleep. The reason you don't want to force it is because you don't want to go to sleep and just toss and turn for a huge chunk of time, because that just kind of reinforces the schedule that you go to bed, you toss and turn for an hour, and then you finally fall asleep. We want to get you to a point where you're going to bed and you're falling asleep within 20 minutes. If you are awake longer than 20 or 30 minutes, get out of bed, keep the lights low, and do something meditative or boring in order to help you fall asleep. Don't watch the clock. This just promotes anxiety, which ironically disrupts the sleep drive. Exercise, of course, is something that is also extremely helpful for sleep, primarily because it tires the body mentally and physically. It also acts as an excellent Zeitgeber if done at the same time each day. Because body temperature is related to sleep, meaning that our body temperature decreases at night, if you go to bed and your body temperature is high, that can really interfere with sleep. So for that reason, we want to avoid especially aerobic exercise about 6 hours before bed, because this can leave your body temperature higher. There are plenty of people who like to exercise in the evening and sleep fine. Again, kind of like the caffeine. If that's you, great. But if you're having a tough time with sleep, let's dial the exercise back to at least 6 hours before you're going to bed. And again, this is because cooler body temperatures are associated with sleep, warmer temperatures are associated with waking. The best time to exercise in general is late afternoon. But ultimately, whether it's late afternoon or the morning, the most important thing is regularity. And this can be associated with increased deep sleep and decreased sleep latency, meaning that you're falling asleep more quickly and you're spending more time in deep sleep. So moving on to the more intense approaches, which again are best for insomnia and the bipolar disorders. First up, we have interpersonal social rhythm therapy, which is particularly good for bipolar disorders. The idea of this is that we're going to anchor our day around regularity, specifically regular Zeitgebers, and kind of controlling when we're engaging in energizing versus relaxing activities. And the basis of this is that the bipolar disorders may really be circadian rhythm disorders, and that bipolar disorders may impact people who are really sensitive to circadian rhythm deviations. Like they can't just stay up super late one night and then like get up early and then go to bed early and do a bunch of random things. These are people who need consistency, and a lack of consistency is what causes the bipolar symptoms. So we want consistency anchored with Zeitgebers and controlling when we're doing energizing versus relaxing things. So the keys are a brisk morning and a slow evening. So we want to get out of bed at the same time every day and immediately. We want to get up, we want to make the bed. Light alarms are really nice. And this is true whether you have a bipolar disorder or not. Light alarms are depicted in this graphic on the upper side of the right side of the screen, upper end of the right side of the screen. These are alarms where it's a light that gradually turns on over about 30 minutes versus using a noise-based alarm. These are really nice because light slowly pulls you out of deep sleep versus an alarm just wakes you up when the time goes off. And so one of the reasons that you might feel more awake on some mornings versus others, even though you're getting up at the same time, is because you're waking up from light versus deep sleep, and waking up from light sleep is going to leave you feeling more energized. So I like recommending light alarm clocks for really everybody, but for bipolar disorders, we want to get out of bed immediately. We don't want to linger in bed. We want to make the bed, get on with the day. Ideally incorporate an energizing activity like dancing around to morning playlist, getting involved with like a book that you really like or a show that you really like, going for a walk, using aromatherapy. As far as walks go, I like to recommend a 45-minute brisk walk every other day, which seems to work as well as an antidepressant and boost memory as well. On the flip side, we want to really be purposeful about slowing down in the evening, an electronic-free zone at least 30 minutes before bed, cooler temperatures, dim lights, and incorporating relaxing activities like meditation, stretching, muscle relaxation, calm music, aromatherapy. Absolutely no bright lights, crowds, intense conversations. You don't want to be having like a big talk with like your partner or parent or something like that, and absolutely no goal directed activities. So we're not working on a craft project, we're not doing homework. Shift those things to the morning instead. I went to a talk on this particular therapeutic approach a couple years ago, and the guy kind of leading the talk was sharing a story about a client of his who had bipolar 1 disorder, and he was helping to prep her to go to Disney World with her family. And the plan was like they were going to hit the park early in the day, and she in particular had to leave around 2 or 3 p.m. to begin kind of winding down because Disney World is just so intense. And so that's a good example of someone who's kind of tailoring this idea of the brisk, intense morning and then really winding down and keeping that activity level consistent. So again, some pieces of this are good advice for everybody, but in particular, really being rigid with this can be really great for the bipolar disorders. Something else that can be really great for the bipolar disorders, in addition to insomnia, is dark therapy. Basically, what this entails is prescribing people to darkness at night. So it's kind of like if we were to remove the influence of technology and light, and if the person experienced darkness when the sun went down and light when the sun came up. So again, this is really great for mania and insomnia, and variants can also be helpful for shift workers and nursing moms as well. So what we want to do is about 2 hours before bed until 8 a.m., we want to prescribe virtual darkness. So this doesn't mean that the lights are literally out, but it means that we are avoiding blue light, which is the light that our brains associate with wakefulness. And so we can do this by using blue light filters in the form of glasses that you wear, or you can actually get filters to put over your computer screens and your phone screens that will filter out these lights. So you can still see, but your brain isn't getting the type of light that we see in the morning that our brains associate with being awake. And when we are asleep, we're in total darkness, meaning blackout shades, an eye mask, something like that. And we're using like a light based alarm clock to wake up. If we're dealing with severe mania that may be associated with like a bipolar 1 disorder, then we want to extend that window from 6 p.m. until 8 a.m. One of the reasons that we're focusing so strongly on blue light is because melatonin rises in dim light or when a person is wearing blue light glasses. And so by limiting blue light, we're helping that person's melatonin to naturally rise, preparing them for bed. Taking a melatonin supplement does not have the same effect. If you are using melatonin, I recommend taking sparingly, about 1 to 3 milligrams as needed. And if you're doing so, do so 2 hours before bed because it takes a little while to kick in. This is not something you should take like 30 minutes before bed. Alternatives include just having a bedtime routine, going to bed at the same time, dim lighting before bed. All of that stuff is going to help to naturally boost your melatonin. One good use for melatonin is it can help to ease jet lag. You can take melatonin to help your body either retain your old sleep schedule if you're not going to be in this new time zone long, or help you adjust to the new schedule. And then as far as shift workers and nursing moms go, blue light filters can be a helpful way to be awake at night without waking your brain back up. And so like if a nursing mom, for instance, has to get up to feed her child, rather than turning the lights on and waking the brain back up, you can turn the lights on and use a blue light filter so that you can see what you're doing, but that your brain is still in that relatively dormant state. And then finally, last but not least, is bed restriction. So this is the most severe, and this is going to be for really, really intense insomnia. So what we want to do for this is kind of counterintuitive, but it also makes sense in that we've already covered at this point that oversleeping can actually lead to insomnia. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to limit the time in bed to kind of, the way I explain to clients is we're kind of teaching the brain to take sleep seriously, because in a weird way you can almost think of insomnia as like your brain's not really recognizing the seriousness of bedtime and sleep. You're in bed for like 12 hours, but you're only asleep for 3 of them. So your brain's not taking this opportunity to sleep seriously. So we need to almost punish the situation by limiting bedtime until the brain can kind of take it more seriously. So what we need to do here is a bit of math. We need to start by calculating the total time that a person is spending asleep, not awake in bed over the course of the week. So in order to do this, you'll need a sleep diary. You can get your total amount of sleep by taking the time from 3A until 8 on the sleep diary. And then you can figure out how much time you've spent asleep by subtracting from that 3B, 4, 6, and 7. So this will kind of give you a net total of, the amount of time in bed, factoring out the time that you're awake to give you this sleep time. So you'll divide this sum, or this difference, I should say, you'll divide this difference by 7, and this will give you the average amount of time that you've spent asleep. Add 30 minutes of this to just account for some time to fall asleep. And over the next week, what you're going to do for your patient is you're going to tell them to only spend that amount of time in bed each night. You'll choose a regular wake time that fits with this. So if your number is 7, and you need to get up, work is at 9, so getting up at 7:30 makes sense. And so that means you need to be going to bed at 12:30. Do not restrict past 5 hours, 6.5 hours if you're working with someone with bipolar. So we don't want to limit it too much, but we do definitely want to limit it. After and over that course of that week, you're going to have them fill out another sleep diary. After a week, we're basically going to calculate that stuff again. So we're going to take the total, we're going to subtract out the amount of time that they were awake, and we're going to have the total amount of time that they were asleep. And with this, we're going to calculate the person's sleep efficiency, which we can do by dividing the time asleep by the total time in bed and multiplying that by 100. And we'll get a number between 0 and 100. And this will tell us what to do next. If a person's sleep efficiency is less than 85%, this means that they're spending too much time in bed, and that we need to subtract 15 minutes from the time in bed. So if sleep efficiency is low, that means we're basically spending more time in bed than we need to, that your body's not efficiently using that time in bed. And that's basically what's happening again with insomnia. It's like your brain's not taking sleep seriously. And so if it's less than 85% for the next week, we want to subtract 15 minutes from that total number and basically do the whole process again. If sleep efficiency is greater than 90%, that means that the person is spending too little time in bed, and we need to add 15 minutes. So this may be counterintuitive. A lot of people think that the higher the number, the better. And, you may use various sleep apps on your smartwatches or your phones and think like, oh, my sleep efficiency is 95. That's great. That's actually not great, because what that means is that your body is so tired that you're passing out, and your body shouldn't be that desperate for sleep. So if it's over 90, we want to add 15 minutes, and again, rinse and repeat. What we're shooting for is a sleep efficiency between 85 and 90%. That's perfect, and we want to keep that time the same going forward. So you basically repeat this process week in and week out until you hit that 85 to 90% mark. Again, I like to think of this as the most extreme kind of scenario. So I like to work through the other interventions first, because it can be really tough to pitch to, especially someone with insomnia, the idea of spending less time in bed. But I have seen really good results from this, and this is a really strong, empirically supported approach for sleep improvement, particularly in the context of insomnia. Woo! So I got this one done before my computer fell asleep, which is great. All right, thanks for joining me, you guys. Yeah.